Will Hunting was 20 years old, but his life hardly reflected his sharp intelligence. He lived in a cramped apartment in a rough Boston neighborhood, spending his days in blue-collar simplicity. By day, he worked as a janitor at the world-famous Massachusetts Institute of Technology. On the surface, he was just another young man pushing a mop down the gleaming university corridors. But behind his quiet eyes, there lived an extraordinary mind. One late afternoon, while scrubbing near a lecture hall, Will noticed a large mathematical equation sprawled across a chalkboard. The board was full of complicated symbols and graphs, the kind that made even top students sweat. The problem wasn't homework, it was a challenge written by Professor Gerald Lembo, MIT's pride and one of the country's most respected mathematicians. Lembo had told his students that anyone capable of solving it by semester's end would earn not only a spot in the university's journal but also his personal respect. For most, it was just an impossible riddle. For Will, it was magnetic. He lingered there, mop in hand, studying the shapes and logic. Numbers danced in his head the way music might to a pianist. Later that night, while his friends dragged him out to a local bar, his mind kept circling back to the board. He laughed when they laughed, drank when they drank, but the equation kept tugging at him like an unfinished sentence. Finally, restless, he rushed home to his shabby apartment. Without a chalkboard, he turned to the bathroom mirror, scribbling in soap and erasing with his sleeve. Hours passed. Mistakes piled up. But eventually, the puzzle gave way. He had done it. That weekend, Will quietly returned to MIT. Between sweeping the hallways and emptying bins, he slipped to the chalkboard and neatly wrote the complete solution. No fanfare. No name signed. Just the truth written in numbers. Days later, Professor Lembo entered the classroom and froze. The problem was solved. Perfectly. He blinked, stunned. His students looked equally shocked. But when he demanded to know who had cracked it, no one spoke. Confused but excited, he decided to up the stakes. On the board, he wrote an even harder theorem, one that had kept him and his colleagues occupied for over 2 years. Whoever the secret genius was, Lembo intended to draw them out. But Will had bigger problems brewing outside the walls of MIT. That same week, while driving around with his lifelong friends, including his closest buddy Chuck, they ran into a group of men from Will's past. Among them was an old bully, someone who had made Will's childhood miserable. Rage flared instantly. He jumped out of the car without thinking and swung. Fists flew, bodies crashed, and the street erupted into a full brawl until the police arrived. This wasn't Will's first fight, and the officers knew it. He was hauled into custody. In court the next morning, Will defended himself with uncanny confidence. He quoted legal precedents and dissected constitutional passages like a trained lawyer. The judge, unimpressed, reminded him of his long list of offenses. His sharp mind couldn't erase his record. Will was sentenced to time behind bars. Professor Lembo, having already become obsessed with finding his mystery mathematician, learned of Will's arrest. To his shock, the janitor who scrubbed his halls was the very man who had solved the theorem. Lembo intervened, persuading the court to release Will under strict conditions, weekly advanced mathematics sessions with him, and mandatory therapy sessions to address Will's temper and destructive habits. Will reluctantly agreed, anything to avoid prison. Mathematics was effortless. Will breezed through problems that left graduate students bewildered. Lembo was in awe, certain he had discovered a once-in-a-century genius. But therapy was another story. The first psychologist Lembo arranged lasted only one session before storming out, rattled after Will tore apart his book and mocked his theories. The next tried hypnosis, but Will ridiculed the process, cracking jokes until the man gave up. One by one, the professionals failed. Finally, desperate, Lembo turned to an old friend from his college days, Sean McGuire, a community college professor and therapist who carried his own share of scars. Will walked into Sean's office, ready for another round of games. He cracked jokes, smirked, and poked at every sentence Sean said. For a while, Sean remained patient, studying him. But when Will cruelly dragged Sean's late wife into his taunts, the calm man snapped. He grabbed Will's attention with quiet fury, warning him never to speak of her again. Unlike the others, Sean wasn't intimidated or thrown off. Sean invited Will to meet him outside. They sat on a park bench in the crisp Boston air. Sean didn't lecture about textbooks or diagnoses. Instead, he spoke from the heart. He told Will that intelligence alone doesn't mean wisdom. You've read about love, about war, about art, Sean said, but you've never lived any of it. You think you know, but you don't. You're just a kid hiding behind knowledge. For the first time, Will had no clever comeback. He sat quietly, absorbing. That silence was the beginning. Over time, Will's walls weakened. Slowly, he began talking. First with sarcasm, then with honesty. Their sessions shifted into real conversations. Sean shared stories of his wife, quirks, habits, the little imperfections he cherished. He explained that love isn't about perfection but about choosing someone, flaws included. Will listened more than he spoke. Outside therapy, Will had begun seeing Skylar, a bright medical student he'd met at a bar. Their connection was electric, filled with teasing jokes, late-night talks, and long walks. But when Skylar asked about his past, Will lied, inventing a story about having 12 older brothers. She laughed but sensed the walls behind the humor. Eventually, she asked him to join her in California, where she was heading for medical school. Will panicked. The idea of leaving Boston, of being vulnerable, of risking rejection, it terrified him. He lashed out, accusing her of looking down on him, convinced she only saw him as a poor boy from the wrong side of town. Heartbroken, Skylar confessed her love. Will pushed her away. Meanwhile, Lumbo's excitement over Will's talent grew restless. He arranged prestigious job interviews for him, determined to see him rise to fame and fortune. Will dismissed them all. In one interview with the National Security Agency, he bluntly declared that he wouldn't use his gifts to build weapons or manipulate foreign nations. To him, no salary justified destroying lives. At home, Chuck confronted him. Over beers one night, Chuck admitted his dream, to knock on Will's door one morning and find his friend gone chasing something bigger than their neighborhood. You're sitting on a winning lottery ticket, Chuck said, and you're too scared to cash it. Don't waste your life here with me. You're meant for more. That hit Will harder than any lecture. In therapy, Sean decided it was time to dig deeper. He told Will about his own father, a violent alcoholic, and the nights he spent hiding from beatings. He looked Will in the eye and repeated the words that broke through, "What happened to you wasn't your fault." At first, Will scoffed, brushing it off with jokes. But Sean repeated it again, and again, until Will's defenses shattered. Tears flooded. Years of buried pain spilled out. For the first time, he let someone see the wounded child behind the genius. Soon, Will told Sean he'd accepted one of the jobs Lumbo lined up. But Sean, preparing to travel and rediscover life beyond grief, urged him to make sure it was truly what he wanted. Don't do it for me. Don't do it for Lumbo. Do it for you. On his birthday, Will's friends gifted him a beat-up car they'd built from spare parts. It was their way of saying, go chase something. The next morning, Chuck drove by to pick him up for work. The house was empty. Will was gone. At Sean's office, a letter waited. In it, Will explained that he wasn't taking the job after all. Instead, he was heading west. I gotta go see about a girl, he wrote, the same words Sean once used when he skipped a historic baseball game to meet the woman who would become his wife. Will had finally chosen for himself. He wasn't running from fear anymore. He wasn't hiding behind books, jokes, or fists. He was chasing love, chasing life, chasing the unknown. And in that moment, the janitor from South Boston stepped into his future, not as a math prodigy or a neighborhood tough guy, but as a man ready to live on his own terms.